Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is something of a homecoming for me. I actually grew up as a child approximately 5 miles that direction on a lake called Big Bear Lake. And at that time there were orange trees, clay roads, rattlesnakes, and alligators here. So it's changed a little bit. That was all, however, BD, so before Disney. When someone from an accrediting agency comes to talk to a group, there's sort of a typical reaction you get from the audience. Sort of like that. And you sort of get used to it when you're in this job. It just sort of comes with the territory. I do hope that that's not going to be your reaction. I hope I can do a little bit better than that, but I'm not going to make any promises in that regard. You know, it was interesting. Bruce started with a slide that showed a lot of topics, a lot of issues that are floating around, and I have the same slide basically. And so I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. There's a lot of overlap, but a theme runs through the articles and the speeches about educational innovation. And that theme is that the accrediting agencies are the roadblock. At least a lot of the ones I've read, maybe I'm doing some selective reading, that we're the barrier to innovation. Accreditors, and I might add specifically SAC's Commission on Colleges, is sometimes singled out in those discussions. It's sort of like this from many of your perspectives. The maze or barrier metaphor certainly has some truth in it. I'm not going to deny that. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure that's all bad, as it turns out. But there are examples of innovation among our institutions that have been accepted by review committees, sometimes after a period of review, and yes, sometimes some controversy. But here are some examples. One comes from the state of Florida. Now, this is traditional education, mind you, but New College of Florida, this is straight from their website. I'm just quoting off of their website here. Member in good standing. Students complete 7 contracts in lieu of credit hours, etc., written agreement for each semester, and go on from there. I would call that traditional innovation, if you will, in education. Now, we had mentioned earlier of Old Dominion University. I'm going to mention them maybe a little bit more positively as an innovator. There was certainly an early innovator in terms of using different distance education modalities. Their teletechnet at the time was miles ahead of what other people were doing in terms of two-way video, for example, and they've been moving that in more recent years toward having the iPod courses and direct online courses and the like. And they were also an early adopter among a large public institution, at least, in terms of extensive credit for military experience, use of CLEP and Dante's, and other means of alternative credentialing, which seems to be less common in large public institutions than it is in other parts of our membership. Tusculum College, a small Presbyterian college in Tennessee, has adopted the block system. And this is the one course at a time system where you meet for about 3 weeks, or 3.5 weeks, I think it says there, and then you move into the next course. We heard the Learning on Demand speaking in terms of going to sequencing of courses. Well, there are other institutions which have already done that, and it does not create particular problems for the crediting process. The key thing is explaining what you're doing. In general, I would say the models of innovation throughout our region have been these two groups more than anyone else, community colleges and small private colleges, especially struggling small private colleges, have done a lot of innovation over the years. A wide use of non-credit to credit conversion, the ACE guidelines, as many of you saw probably in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed today with the approval of by ACE of some of the MOOC courses. And by the way, one of the issues there is validation of that the student who's registered for the course is the one taking the course. You know, we have a requirement for that now. And Andrew Ng was one of the speakers at the recent CHIA conference that was held in Washington, and I was there and listened to his presentation. And CHIA is doing things like ProctorU and some of these other things that you've heard about earlier today. And I will tell you that for the most part, they're doing a better job of verifying that the student registered for the course is the student taking the course than most of our member institutions are, that are still telling us that all they're using is a unique user ID and password, which I will also tell you is not going to be viewed as a valid way of validating a student for very long. I mean, it's written into the Fed guidelines right now that you can do that. The Feds will probably eventually change that guideline, and you'll have to have something that's a little bit better than that. These kinds of institutions have done credit by examination for years. Credit by examination is not too far removed from competency-based instruction. And they've also utilized portfolio credit for years. These are not innovations, if you will. I mean, these are things that are around and that are explicitly recognized in the language of the principles of accreditation. If you want a couple of other examples, Lamar University has pioneered, perhaps not pioneered, but they have had a situation where they've worked with a third-party vendor, a for-profit third-party vendor in the provision of some of their online coursework. By the way, that kind of a change is a substantive change, and it does require notification to us when you enter in those kinds of agreements. If you haven't been doing that, you need to. We expect to see a copy of the contract, for example, as part of what's submitted. Virtual College of Texas, when it went through, it was not accredited. We don't accredit systems. We don't accredit system programs, but we do accredit the institutions within systems that utilize those consortium programs. And we've had several of those kinds of programs that have gone through an accrediting process. Of course, we've heard about other regions of the country. Two specific things were mentioned. Western Governors University, which uses competency but is still credit-based. And then also some mention today of Southern New Hampshire University and their College for America, which is, I believe, the first truly competency-based program in terms of having no credits attached to the earning of the degree that's been approved by a regional accreditor with the New England accreditors. Northern Arizona obviously is looking at something very similar, but the re-aggregation of the modules back into courses, into credits on a standard transcript, of course, may mitigate some of that from Higher Learning Commission's perspective. But we do have those. Now, those of you who are at SACS accredited institutions, SACS COC accredited, I'm really working hard on that, by the way. We're SACS COC, we're not SACS. And Bell reminds me of that every time I say SACS. So, our accrediting standards are increasingly geared toward measuring student learning outcomes and college-level competencies. Those of you who've gone through reaffirmation or gone through the fifth-year review process know that that's the case. Those are the standards that get cited most often in our reaffirmation process, are those associated with the measurement of student learning outcomes and the measurement of college-level competencies when we talk about general education. So in spite of what you may have heard even back when the Spellings Commission was meeting, SACS COC has a long-standing reputation for expecting evidence of institutional effectiveness and those kinds of process. Setting expected outcomes, assessing the extent to which they've been met, and then using the findings for improvement. Those same basic concepts underlie competency-based programs. There's not that much difference. So it's not like it's something that's going to surprise the accrediting body when they see people moving in that direction. Now, the main issue in the competency-based education area right now, I would argue, is the credit hour. That's where there is an issue that is presented to the accrediting body, as opposed to what's known as direct assessment. The Department of Education actually did approve an alternative means of establishing degree requirements called direct assessment for Western governors. Western governors chose not to pursue that and went a different direction going with the credit. This is the innovation, if you will, with Southern New Hampshire, is that they're using this direct assessment process. Now, is it written into our principles of accreditation? The answer is no. But it's written into federal law, so it is something we would respond to if we needed to, if we were presented with someone who submitted a substantive change that took that approach. You should know, and I think maybe many of you do know this, that it was not the regional accreditors. In fact, it was explicitly not the regional accreditors who were pushing the Department of Education to enshrine a credit hour standard. We came out very strongly against that. But they adopted one nonetheless. But you do have to agree, I think, that the Department of Education does have a very legitimate interest in ensuring that it's getting something for all the money it spends. And I would argue that until two things happen, both the quality of assessments that we do, and in this case at the program level and at the course or subcourse level, until the quality of assessments improve across the board, and the earnestness, that's a hard word to say, of institutions to really assess competencies improves well beyond where it is today, you can expect slow growth in this area. Both of those two things, I think, will have to take place. So that's some background. I do want to hop to some of our standards and just go over our standards, and I did not bring a copy, I meant to, of my principles up here with me, but of course I have them memorized. Close, but not quite. So let me mention a few. There are some core requirements that we have that are one that's explicitly based in terms of a credit hour definition. Our core requirement 271, and those of you who are not familiar with SACS, core requirements are things that if you don't meet these, oh, thank you. Oh, I did have that. I forgot I gave that to you. You have copies of this. Thank you for reminding me. Actually, I have a copy of that too, now that you mention it. I think, yeah, I do. So I'll give you yours back. I forgot I had done that. Actually, I have one I'm going to add, which I don't have, so that's why the principles would come in handy. The program length standard says that an associate's degree must consist of 60 semester credit hours, a bachelor's degree 120, a graduate degree 30, and it's explicitly worded in terms of semester credit hours. But it does speak in terms of equivalency in there. Now, most of the equivalency takes place in terms of quarter hours. We still have some institutions on quarters, but we also have institutions on units. And we have institutions like New College, which you saw, which has to use some sort of an equivalency justification. Competency-based learning would require some sort of equivalency-based justification. The learning by degrees, or the KCTCS, the direct learning element that they're doing there that's modular, maintains a credit hour link, is my understanding. And so they don't need to go through all this justification. Distance education in general has an issue here relative to the definition of credit hour, but the definition of credit hour, we actually have a separate policy that repeats the federal definition, does allow you to justify equivalency. Now, the word that's in our policy, and that's also in the federal policy, is equivalency of work. Now, it would be better if it were equivalency of learning outcomes, but I think that connection is pretty straightforward, and that reviewers would actually view the connection to be one driven by student learning. The other thing where I think it's relevant to point out, there could be issues with some of these new programs, is core requirement 272, which speaks in terms of program content, and it speaks in terms of having coherent courses of study. And I mentioned this for a couple of reasons, because what we don't do is accredit people who play a brokerage function to grant a degree. You can't just accumulate 60 hours and say, we're going to give you an associate's degree, or accumulate 120 hours and say, we're going to give you a bachelor's degree. There's an expectation that there's some coherence to the course of study. And that's relevant when you get to a collection of modules. That's why it's important, and I like the emphasis that has taken place, that the program is thought out in advance. So you go through and you develop all of the competencies that are relevant to that program, or appropriate to that program, then you work backwards from there. That makes perfectly good sense, and I think can help establish coherence of a course of study. I do want to, it's not core requirement, but we do have a policy statement which I do encourage y'all to look at, and that's a policy statement that is on the quality and integrity of the undergraduate degree, a relatively new policy statement, but it reiterates this idea that, for example, a bachelor's degree is a course of study that is a 120-hour course of study, which is relevant when you start talking about transfer of credit. It says a transfer of credit needs to serve some purpose relative to a course of study. It's also relevant when you start talking about coursework that you have identified as non-transferable as opposed to transferable coursework. You can see the dilemma here. We've had instances quite often where institutions have said, this Associate of Applied Science degree is non-transferable. Therefore, we don't have to meet a lot of the standards associated with transferable coursework into four-year programs. But then an institution enters into an explicit articulation agreement, or there's a statewide articulation agreement, if that might happen in some states, like Florida. That if you enter into that kind of a relationship, you're making a statement about that course. You're saying that that course is a transferable course. Doesn't matter if you've told us that it's non-transferable. If you then turn around and you enter into an agreement to transfer those credits, you're saying, no, actually, it is transferable. And so we're asking for clarity on that as part of our standards. That's a little bit off the topic, but in terms of competencies and pathways and the like, I think it's a very, very relevant thing to bring up. Now, I do want to bring up one other core requirement that I don't have on this list, but just based on some of the earlier presentations. We have a core requirement 2.8, just simply called faculty, but it's really sufficiency of the number of full-time faculty. And it says that you have sufficient number of full-time faculty to maintain the quality and integrity of your programs. And I would suggest that provosts and deans of instruction are having an appropriate level of diligence if they take into consideration, or say, if you're teaching in an online program apart from your regular contract, that is something that is relevant to your overall course load. If you're teaching, I know that adjuncts will part-time go out and string together coursework at 6 different institutions, but I'm not saying that's a good educational practice. Okay. So I think that is something that we are concerned about in terms of the course load that faculty members have. Full-time faculty members that are teaching 2 overloads at their own institution on top of a 15 or an 18-hour load, and then going out and teaching an additional 200 or 300 students through another program is something that I think shifts the burden to the institution to show that our faculty are able to maintain their work in the field. They're still able to serve on committees as they're supposed to. They're still able to advise students as they're supposed to, and the burden's on the institution to show that in those kinds of cases. So, educational innovation is not the same thing as working someone to death, even if they volunteer for it. It's the administrator's responsibility sometimes to tell their faculty member, I know you want that extra money from that extra course, but it's not educationally sound for us to do that. Okay, just leave that idea with you a little bit. Some other standards we already have in place. Acceptance of academic credit standards, very broad standard, mainly a transfer of credit standard, but it already explicitly mentions in that standard things like experiential learning and credit by examination. So this is something that's already recognized in the principles. We also have a standard, practices for awarding credit, and that standard, 3.4.6, includes the phrase, it says that you have sound practices for determining the level and amount of credit regardless of format or mode of delivery. Okay, so what it says is that standard can cover alternative means of delivery, but it is something you have to pay attention to. And it says awarding credit, if you're not awarding credit, you're awarding competencies or verifying competencies. I think that same standard would still apply. It would be viewed as applying. Lots of other standards that become relevant. Consortial contractual relationships and the delivery of coursework is one that a lot of innovations bump up against, because a lot of them involve third-party vendors or involve a consortium of institutions offering something. We expect to be notified of contractual consortial relationships when they come along. We don't have to approve them all, but we do expect to be notified. Now, some good news for some of y'all. If you actually go to our website today, as a matter of fact, you will find that there is no longer a collaborative academic adventure, arrangements policy. There's now a policy that talks more about dealing with strictly joint and dual degree arrangements. We've modified that policy. Some of you knew that from the annual meeting that took place. The revised policy is now up on our website. Those of you who work in substantive change need to be aware that that policy is now revised, and the new version is up on our website as of today. A letter was sent out from Bell Whelan, I think yesterday on this, or maybe even today, to accreditation liaisons and presidents about that, but you all need to be aware of that. The good news is, what it did is it removed a lot of things from the category of being substantive changes. It removed a lot of notification requirements. And it also suggested that in some cases, if you know something's going to be something where you have to submit a prospectus, don't send us notification and then wait to get a letter back from us and then send us later on the prospectus after you get the letter back. Just send us one letter with the prospectus. It cuts the number of submissions that our office has to deal with in half every time you do that, and it will speed up the process all the way through. So pay attention to that. That's an important thing to be aware of. You know, I do want to read this to you. This is kind of interesting. Let's see if I can get it to come up on the old phone here. This comes from one of our policies, and see if this sounds familiar to you. This is a definition. A program typically designed for that's the wrong thing. A formal educational process under which the institution provides instructional materials by electronic transmission, including examinations on the materials to students who are separated from the instructor. Interaction between the instructor and the student is limited, is not regular and substantive, and is primarily initiated by the student. Courses are typically self-paced. That's a definition. Now, that sounds pretty close to me to a lot of asynchronous, by-the-month coursework. You can do as much as you want within a month. I may be wrong. That may not be the way those programs work at all. We've had that definition for years. It's called correspondence education. And you know, that's not an educational innovation. It's something that's been around a long, long time. The reason people don't like that definition, and I'm no expert on federal financial aid, and don't want to be either, but I think the reason a lot of people don't like that definition is the federal rules basically give you lesser dollars when you have a correspondence education program. But distance education programs can be correspondence education programs if the role of the faculty is very limited in those programs. There's nothing wrong with correspondence programs, but that's what they are. If you keep the level of faculty involvement down. Very happy to hear the explanation of Northern Arizona, for example, and the proactive signals that are being sent to faculty members, the new innovations that you just saw in Blackboard that allow more proactive attention by faculty members in terms of how students are doing. That may help make a distinction between distance education that's not correspondence education and distance education that is correspondence education. But that is an area that you need to be aware of as you're dealing with the Department of Education in terms of what your courses are and what they're called. All of these standards are relevant. The ones 352 and 363, those of you who are not familiar with our standards, those are ones that say, look, we are an institutional accreditor. We're not accrediting the degrees, we're accrediting the institution that is granting the degrees. And what this says is that if you're going to grant the degree, there has to be a minimum amount of the coursework which is earned at your institution. In undergraduate programs, that number is 25%. For graduate programs, that number is a third. That has to be delivered by your institution. That is important as you work through some of these new arrangements, especially broad consortium arrangements. That's an important issue also as you work toward such things as a competency-based program. I don't think that that standard is waived for a competency-based program. So it is something to pay attention to. Now, I would argue that Bruce was also correct where he argued that largely the online, on-campus issue is now moot. It's largely moot with accreditors too. We have so many institutions that are offering online instruction that is not anything new to us. Is there any institution of higher learning in this group, in the state of Florida or other states, that is not, it's a metaphor, but I largely agree with it. The whitewater metaphor. But I will tell you this, you might as well get ready for it. And that's all I have, so thank you. Got us back on schedule.